In 1963, a Pontiac rolled off the assembly line that was so fast, so dominant, that General Motors itself tried to bury it. The car was called the Superduty, and the engine under its hood was the 421, a monster that would win races, terrify competitors, and ultimately trigger a corporate conspiracy to kill the entire muscle car movement before it could truly begin. This is the story of how one engine became too powerful for its own good. Along the way, we'll encounter backroom deals, manufacturer panic, a racing ban that shocked the industry, and a power war that the automakers themselves tried to stop. So let us begin. But first, how did American cars get so obsessed with horsepower in the first place? See, to understand the 421 Superduty, you have to understand what was happening in America in the late 1950s. The country was booming, suburbs were sprawling, highways were being built at a frantic pace, and young Americans, kids who'd grown up during the war, who'd watched their fathers come home and start families. They wanted something their parents never had. They wanted speed. The car companies noticed. Of course they did. And what started as a trickle of performance options became a flood. Chevrolet dropped the small block V8 into the Corvette. Ford answered with the Thunderbird. Chrysler built the 300-letter cars with their hemispherical combustion chambers. By the end of the decade, every manufacturer in Detroit was locked in an unofficial arms race, each one trying to outdo the others with bigger engines, more horsepower, faster quarter-mile times. Now, here's the thing. This was all happening in the shadows. The automakers didn't openly advertise that they were building race cars for the street. There was a gentleman's agreement, an unwritten understanding that factory-backed racing was unseemly, dangerous even. The Automobile Manufacturers Association had officially banned direct factory involvement in racing back in 1957. It was supposed to cool things down. It didn't. What it did was push everything underground. The companies stopped publicly supporting racing teams. But behind closed doors, engineers were building the most powerful engines they'd ever designed. They just couldn't talk about it. And no company played this game better than Pontiac. Pontiac in the late 1950s was struggling. It was your grandfather's car, reliable, boring, forgettable. The brand was dying a slow death, outsold by Chevrolet, outperformed by Ford, ignored by anyone under 40. Something had to change. Enter Bunkie Knudsen. Seaman Bunkie Knudsen became general manager of Pontiac in 1956, and he had one mission: make people care about Pontiac again. His strategy was simple: build fast cars, win races, let the victories speak for themselves. I mention this because Knudsen didn't just want Pontiac to be competitive. He wanted dominance, complete, undeniable, humiliating dominance over every other brand on the track, and to achieve that, he turned to a man named John DeLorean. Yes, that John DeLorean. Before the stainless steel sports car, before the cocaine bust, before all of it, DeLorean was an engineer at Pontiac. And he was brilliant, ambitious, maybe a little too ambitious for his own good. DeLorean and his team began working on what would become the Superduty engine program. The idea was straightforward: take Pontiac's existing V8 architecture and push it as far as it could possibly go. Bigger displacement, better breathing, more power than anyone thought possible. The first Superduty engine appeared in 1959, a 389 cubic inch V8 that produced somewhere around 345 horsepower. That doesn't sound like much today, but in 1959 it was extraordinary. Pontiac Catalinas equipped with Superduty engines started showing up at drag strips and stock car races, and they started winning. But Pontiac wasn't satisfied, not even close. By 1961, the engineers had bored out the 389 to 421 cubic inches. The new engine featured forged internals, a radical camshaft, and cylinder heads that flowed like nothing else on the market. In its most aggressive tune, the so-called 421 Superduty, the engine produced over 400 horsepower. Some estimates put it closer to 500. Think about that for a second. In 1961, Pontiac was building a production engine that could make 500 horsepower. Most family sedans at the time had maybe 150. The 421 Superduty wasn't just fast, it was absurdly, almost comically fast. Pontiac dropped these engines into lightweight Catalinas, stripping out sound deadening, using aluminum body panels, deleting anything that added unnecessary weight. The result was a car that looked like a normal sedan, but ran like a purpose-built race car. And the results spoke for themselves. In 1962, Pontiac won the Daytona 500 qualifier with a Super Duty Catalina. They dominated the NHRA's stock eliminator class. At drag strips across the country, Super Duty Pontiacs were running 11-second quarter miles, times that most sports cars couldn't match. The competition noticed, Ford noticed, Chrysler noticed, and they did what any self-respecting American automaker would do. They escalated. Ford responded with the 406 cubic inch FE engine, pushing output past 400 horsepower. Chrysler unleashed the 413 Max Wedge, a brutal piece of machinery designed specifically for drag racing. Chevrolet, despite officially staying out of the horsepower war, quietly developed the Z11 program, a 427 cubic inch engine package that was never meant to exist. By late 1962, the situation had spiraled completely out of control. The manufacturers were locked in an arms race that none of them could afford to lose. Every few months, someone unveiled a bigger engine, a lighter car, a more radical combination. The horsepower numbers kept climbing: 400, 425, 450. There seemed to be no ceiling. Now this is where it gets interesting, because while the engineers were having the time of their lives, the executives were getting nervous. See, there was a problem with all this racing success. Actually, there were several problems. The first was liability. These were street-legal cars being sold to ordinary customers, teenagers in many cases, and they had more power than professional race cars. Insurance companies were starting to ask questions. Safety advocates were starting to complain. The press was running stories about drag racing deaths. The second problem was money. The Super Duty program cost a fortune, building hand-assembled race engines, supporting factory teams, developing ever more powerful machinery. None of it came cheap. And the return on investment was questionable at best. Sure, Pontiac was winning races, but were those wins actually translating into showroom sales? The third problem, and this was the big one, was Washington. The federal government was paying attention. There were rumblings about safety regulations, fuel economy standards, emissions controls. The last thing any automaker wanted was congressional hearings about why they were selling 500 horsepower missiles to 19-year-olds. By early 1963, the pressure had reached a breaking point, and then, almost overnight, everything changed. On January 21, 1963, General Motors issued an internal memo that would reshape the American automotive industry. The memo came directly from the top, from the 14th floor of GM's headquarters in Detroit, where the real decisions were made. And it contained a single, devastating instruction. All divisions were to immediately cease any involvement in racing activities, not reduce, not scale back, cease. The 421 Super Duty program was dead, effective immediately. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do this every week. All right, here's what happened next. Because the story doesn't end with that memo, not even close. The official explanation was corporate responsibility. GM claimed it was responding to public concern about traffic safety. The company was getting out of racing because racing encouraged dangerous driving. It was the responsible thing to do. That was the public story. The real story was considerably messier. What actually happened was a coordinated effort by the major automakers to collectively step back from the horsepower war. And I do mean coordinated. There's no smoking gun, no secret meeting in a darkened boardroom where executives divided up the market. But the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Within weeks of GM's announcement, Ford quietly scaled back its own racing program. Chrysler followed shortly after. By the summer of 1963, all three major manufacturers had effectively agreed to stop building factory race cars. Was it a conspiracy? In the legal sense, probably not. In the practical sense? Yeah, kind of. The automakers had looked at where the horsepower war was heading, and they'd collectively decided to pump the brakes. Too much risk, too much scrutiny, too much chance that someone would get hurt, or worse, that the government would step in and start regulating. The timing wasn't coincidental either. In 1963, Ralph Nader was already researching what would become unsafe at any speed. Consumer safety was becoming a national conversation. The automakers saw the writing on the wall, and they decided to get out ahead of it. For Pontiac, the impact was immediate and devastating. The Superduty program had been the crown jewel of the division's performance image. Hundreds of 421 Superduty engines were sitting in warehouses, partially assembled, waiting for cars that would never be built. Engineers who'd devoted years to the program were reassigned to more mundane projects. The momentum that Bunkie Knudsen had built, the racing wins, the performance reputation, the excitement, all of it evaporated almost overnight. The total production numbers tell the story. In 1962, Pontiac had built hundreds of Super Duty-equipped cars. In 1963, after the ban, roughly 88 units. That was it. 88 cars, and then nothing. Now, here's the thing about bans, especially voluntary industry-wide bans, coordinated without any formal agreement. They never last. By 1964, Ford was back in racing. Carroll Shelby was building GT350 Mustangs. The total performance campaign was in full swing. Ford had never really believed in the gentleman's agreement anyway. They'd just pretended to go along while quietly continuing development. Chrysler followed Ford back into the fray. The Hemi returned for 1964, bigger and badder than ever. Richard Petty was winning NASCAR races with it. The horsepower war, which was supposed to be over, was very much not over. And GM? GM stuck to its guns. Mostly. Officially, the corporation maintained its no-racing policy well into the late 1960s. Unofficially, of course, things were different. Chevrolet somehow kept developing high-performance engines. The Ford 27 mysteriously appeared in production cars. Corvette somehow remained competitive on the track. But Pontiac, the division that had started the whole thing, that had built the Super Duty, that had shown everyone what was possible, Pontiac was stuck. The engineers wanted to race. The dealers wanted to race. Everyone wanted to get back in the fight. But the corporate mandate held. It wasn't until 1964 that Pontiac found its workaround. If they couldn't build race cars, they'd build something else instead. Something that technically wasn't a race car, but could perform like one. Something that would change everything. The GTO. The 1964 Pontiac GTO is generally credited as the car that started the muscle car era, and in a very real sense, it was a direct response to the Super Duty ban. John DeLorean, the same engineer who'd helped create the Super Duty, had an idea. What if you took a mid-sized car, stuffed a big engine into it, and sold it as a regular production option? No special ordering required. No racing association approval needed. Just walk into a dealer, check a box, and drive away in something fast. The brilliance was in the execution. The GTO used Pontiac's 389 cubic inch V8, technically not the biggest engine available, but certainly powerful enough. It came with a 4-barrel carburetor, a performance camshaft, and the option for 3 2-barrel carbs in the tri-power configuration. In that setup, the engine made 348 horsepower. Officially, anyway. Real-world numbers were probably higher. What made the GTO revolutionary wasn't the specifications, it was the accessibility. This wasn't a special order race car that cost a fortune and took months to arrive. This was a mass-produced automobile that any dealership could sell to anyone with the money to buy it. Performance for the masses. The sales figures proved the concept. Pontiac expected to sell maybe 5,000 GTOs in the first year. They sold over 32,000. The following year, sales nearly tripled. By 1966, the GTO was one of the best-selling performance cars in America, and this is where the story gets really interesting, because the GTO's success did something unexpected. It brought the horsepower war back, bigger, louder, and more public than ever before. See, when GM banned racing in 1963, the executives thought they were ending something. What they actually did was redirect it. Instead of factory-backed race teams competing on tracks, the competition moved to showroom floors. Who could build the most powerful street car? Who could claim the fastest quarter-mile time? Who could outmuscle the competition in magazine tests? The GTO forced everyone's hand. Ford responded with the Mustang, which by 1965 could be ordered with a 271 horsepower V8. Chrysler dropped Hemis into Dodge Coronets and Plymouth Satellites. Chevrolet finally admitted what everyone already knew and introduced the Chevelle SS 396. By 1967, the muscle car era was in full swing. Every major manufacturer offered at least one tire-shredding, gas-guzzling, ridiculously overpowered machine. The horsepower numbers kept climbing. 400, 425. 450. The very ceiling that GM had tried to establish in 1963 was blown apart within 4 years. And the 421 Superduty, the engine that had started it all? In a strange way, it had won. The program itself was dead, but its spirit lived on in every muscle car that followed. The idea that a regular person could walk into a dealership and drive away in something genuinely fast. That was the Super Duty's legacy. Pontiac had proved it was possible. The GTO made it mainstream, and everyone else followed. But there's another side to this story. Because the same forces that killed the Super Duty, safety concerns, government pressure, insurance costs, never really went away. They just waited. By the late 1960s, the warnings were becoming harder to ignore. Insurance rates for young men buying muscle cars had become astronomical. Advocacy groups were demanding action. The federal government was implementing its first-ever safety standards. And looming on the horizon, though nobody knew it yet, was the oil crisis that would bring the entire performance car market crashing down. The muscle car era peaked around 1970. That was the year of the 454 LS6, the 440 six-pack, the 455 Stage 1. Horsepower figures had never been higher. Quarter-mile times had never been lower, and then it was over. The Clean Air Act of 1970 introduced emissions standards that gutted performance engines. Insurance companies effectively made high-power cars unaffordable for anyone under 30. Rising gas prices made fuel efficiency suddenly relevant. By 1973, the muscle car era was dead. Horsepower ratings cratered. Performance cars became neutered shadows of their former selves. It would take nearly 40 years for American performance cars to recover. Not until the late 2000s would mainstream vehicles match the power levels of 1970. The Camaro ZL1, the Challenger Hellcat, the GT500, these modern machines can finally compete with their ancestors. But it took 4 decades of technological advancement to get there. And what of the people who made the Super Duty possible? Bunkie Knudsen left Pontiac in 1961 to become general manager of Chevrolet. He later became president of Ford, the only person ever to hold executive positions at all 3 major American automakers. He died in 1998, remembered as one of the most influential automotive executives of the 20th century, the man who saved Pontiac from irrelevance, who launched the performance era, who proved that racing wins sell cars. John DeLorean's story is more complicated. He left GM in 1973 to start his own company. The DeLorean Motor Company produced exactly one car, the stainless steel DMC-12, that would become famous as the time machine in Back to the Future. The company collapsed in 1982. DeLorean was arrested for drug trafficking, though he was later acquitted. He spent his remaining years fighting legal battles and chasing failed ventures. He died in 2005, his brilliance ultimately overshadowed by his ambition. The Pontiac brand itself survived until 2010, when GM killed it during the automotive industry's financial collapse. The division that had once been the performance leader, that had built the Superduty and the GTO and the Trans Am, was deemed expendable in a corporate restructuring. No more Pontiacs would ever be built. And the 421 Superduty engines themselves? Those 88 cars from 1963, the last of their kind, are among the most valuable collector cars in existence today. Survivors change hands for 7 figures. Documented original examples are almost impossible to find. The engines that GM tried to suppress became automotive holy grails, worth more dead than they ever could have been alive. There's a certain irony in that. GM banned the Superduty because it was too powerful, too dangerous, too much. They tried to put the genie back in the bottle, and all they accomplished was ensuring that the legend would grow. Because here's what GM didn't understand in 1963, and what the automakers have never really understood about performance cars. People want fast. They always have. They always will. You can ban it, regulate it, price it out of reach, and it doesn't matter. The desire doesn't go away. It just goes underground, or into backyards, or into aftermarket parts, or into whatever outlet it can find. The 421 Superduty didn't destroy the muscle car market. If anything, it created it. The brief, brilliant burst of factory-backed performance racing in the early 1960s showed an entire generation what was possible. And once they'd seen it, they couldn't unsee it. The ban of 1963 was supposed to end something. Instead, it transformed it. The horsepower war moved from racetracks to showrooms. The competition became even fiercer. The cars became even faster. And millions of Americans got to experience performance that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Would it have been safer if the automakers had never gotten into the horsepower war? Probably. Would the muscle car era have been as exciting? Definitely not. The 421 Superduty remains one of the most significant engines ever built in America. Not because of its production numbers, those were tiny. Not because of its racing victories, though those were impressive, but because of what it represented. The idea that a factory could build something genuinely fast, put it in a car anyone could buy, and let the results speak for themselves. That idea never died. It just evolved. And that is the story of the Pontiac 421 Superduty, the engine that was too fast for its own good, and the corporate conspiracy that tried to stop it. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard about the 1963 racing ban before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.